Hello, welcome back to the channel. My name is Calvin Rankin, and we are having a series of Bible study lessons from the book of Daniel. And we are in chapter 4, and we've made it up through the first 27 verses of the chapter. So it means in this video, we're going to be starting with verse 28 of chapter 4. Now, so far in the chapter, what's been happening is that basically King Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream, and the dream bothered him. So Daniel, through the anointing and power of God, is able to give Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation. And basically the interpretation is that because Nebuchadnezzar doesn't recognize who God is, God's going to take his mind away. It says for 7 periods of time, which can be months, years, weeks, we don't know. But for 7 periods of time, his mind is going to be taken away so that he actually thinks that he's a cow. He's going to go out and he's going to eat grass like a cow. He's going to sleep out under the open in the rain and in the dew just like a cow. He's going to do everything the cow does. So basically, he's going to be out of his mind for this period of time. And we do know that there is a very rare psychological disorder called boanthropy. And boanthropy is a condition in which a person actually does think they're a cow. They do. And so he's going to suffer this affliction for 7 periods of time. God's gonna keep his kingdom safe for him so that while he's out there thinking he's a cow and eating like a cow, once he recognizes through this process that God is God, then God's going to restore him back to the kingdom, and that's what's going to happen. But Daniel is really sorrowful for this interpretation, so he ends by saying, "Oh king, please, don't let this happen to you. Break off your sins. Stop sinning. Stop being such a cruel man, and maybe there will be a lengthening of your prosperity. Maybe this won't happen to you." And so basically, that's where we ended in the last video with verse 27. And so we're going to take over 28 now to see what's going to happen after the dream and after Daniel's warning and all of that. So verse 28 says, "All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar." In other words, because Nebuchadnezzar is the one who's writing this. Daniel's not writing it, Nebuchadnezzar's writing it. And he's telling his whole kingdom in this chapter 4, which is his letter to all of his kingdom, what happened to him. And this is his recounting. And he says, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, meaning everything that the dream was and everything that Daniel said actually happened. And he's going to tell us how it happened, basically now, starting with verse 29. He says, at the end of 12 months, meaning 12 months after this dream, 12 months after Daniel had given him the interpretation, at the end of 12 months, meaning King Nebuchadnezzar, was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" In other words, aren't I so incredible? Look at all the awesome things that I've made, all the awesome things that I've created. I'm just awesome, basically is what he was saying. And then verse 31 says, "While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken. The kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will." Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. So in other words, he's sitting on the top of his palace saying, "Oh, I'm awesome, look at everything I've done." And as soon as he says that, a voice from heaven comes and says, now the dream is going to happen. And then, right then, on the spot, Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind, and he goes out just like an ox, and he eats grass like an ox. It says that his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. In other words, he was out there a long time. And then it says, at the end of the days that it took for him to be able to recognize that God was God. At the end of the 7 periods of time, it says, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So this is awesome. because at the end of the 7 periods of time, his reason does return to him, and he looks up to heaven and he basically starts glorifying God. He starts honoring God. And it's interesting because what he honors God about, he doesn't say, God is the God of salvation. He doesn't say all that. He says, man, God rules everything. God runs everything. Everything God runs. He is the king above every king. Nothing happens without him, and nobody can resist him. Nobody, if God wants to do something, who can stop him? Basically, that's what he says. And it's interesting because there are lots of people who think that they can resist God. They can stop God. They can circumvent God. And God's like, no, because even when you try to resist me, your resistance I use for my own plans to bring about what I want. The classic case in point is with Jesus himself. The Roman government and the Jewish people at that time resisted Christ. And resisting him, they put him on the cross and nailed him. But they didn't know that their resistance was actually a part of God's plan. He actually used their resistance, because we wouldn't have salvation unless Jesus died. And even Jesus said, that's what I came for. I came to die. So he used their resistance to further his plans. And that's what God does now. So God runs everything. He rules everything. There's nothing you can really do to stop him. And Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that. And that's awesome. Now, at this point, there is some debate about whether or not, at this point, this is where Nebuchadnezzar gets saved, so to speak, gives his life to God and commits himself to him. There's some debate about that because it's not quite clear. And I actually am part of those people that don't really think he does, quote unquote, get saved, because there's really some things that he says back in verse 8 and verse 9 of chapter 4. It shows that actually his allegiance is still with his old gods, but he does recognize that God is above all those gods, and that God is amazing above all the gods that he serves. But that doesn't mean he gives up his gods. There are cultures in times past where they reckon, like even the Romans, the Greeks, and others as well, some American Indian tribes as well, they recognize that they serve their gods, they worship their gods, they sacrifice to their gods, and they recognize that above their gods there's another God somewhere. They don't know who he is, they don't know anything about him, but they know that he's out there somewhere, and that he wants them to worship these other gods, because these other gods are under him, and therefore to worship him is to worship these other gods. So in other words, it's like this one God that they don't know, that's over all the other gods, is the God to be worshipped by worshiping the other gods. And the way I see it is Nebuchadnezzar has something else, something going on like that, where he's recognizing, wow, this is the amazing God, this is the big God, this is the true God, but he still holds on to his other gods. So in other words, he's not quite getting saved here. I don't think so. And I could be wrong. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar could be in heaven right now, enjoying some manna and some whatever stuff. He's just hanging out with the angels. He could be. I don't expect to see him there, but I could be wrong, and I allow for that. But anyway, either way, he's recognizing things about God he did not know before. He's recognizing that God is amazing, that God is over everything, that there's nothing out of his control, that even if you think you're resisting God, you're really not resisting God, you're really playing into his hands, and he just does whatever he wants to. And so this is an amazing realization that a lot of people don't come to. There's a story, and I don't want to belabor this point too long, but there's a story that I love to hear. It's a story about how there was a little old lady who lived in a house. She didn't have a lot of money, but she was a Christian. She loved the Lord. And I don't know if this is a true story or made up story, but I like the story. But this little old lady who was a Christian, who didn't have much money, she had a neighbor who was an atheist. And this neighbor would always ridicule her about her belief in God and her faith in God. And if God really loves you, why are you having to suffer like this and struggle like this? And one day he sees he's walking, and he sees through the lady's window. I guess she has it open and she's praying, and she says, Lord, please, can you send some food? Because again, she doesn't have money, so she's praying, Lord, can you please send some food? Can you please send some food? And this atheist gets in his head, aha, I know how I'm going to trick her now. I'm going to show her God really isn't real. So he runs to the supermarket and he buys food. And he brings the food and sets it on the doorstep of the lady, and he pushes the doorbell. And he runs and he hides, but he hides where he can see. And the lady comes out to see who's ringing her doorbell, and she sees all this food, all these groceries on her doorstep, and she begins to praise God. Oh God, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You brought the food just like I asked, Thank you so much. And the atheist pops out and says, aha, see, that got you. That wasn't God. I was the one who bought that food. God didn't do anything for you. I was the one who bought it. And the lady, undaunted, begins to worship God and says, God, you are so amazing. Not only did you bring me food, but you used the devil to bring it too. Thank you, God. You control everything. And I love that story because it illustrates that people who think they're fighting against God and disproving God actually end up working in God's will, even though they think they're not. And so I love that story. But anyway, on with the story we're reading here. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes to his senses, begins to worship and praise God as being just over everything and controlling everything. And he says in verse 36, at the same time, meaning at the same time I began to recognize who God was, at the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. In other words, I was reestablished back into my kingdom. I was out here running around like a wild man, looking like a crazy man, with long claws and hair like feathers and eating grass. And now I'm back in my senses, and not only am I back in my senses, but I got restored to all the glory that I had before as the king. But of course his attitude is different now. But he says, my counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. So he says that the way it happened is that his officials who were under him, his court officials, came looking for him. And they found him and brought him back. But see, even that was God's timing, because if they had gone looking for him, say, a couple days before, he still would have been out of his mind. They wouldn't be able to bring him back into the kingdom. And if he had come into his mind without them coming to look for him, then he would have come to try to get his kingdom back, and they would have been like, no, you're the crazy man that was running around. You're not coming back. But God fulfilled his promise in the dream. He had said he was going to confirm his kingdom to him. And so he brought everything together at the right time so that Nebuchadnezzar could get his senses back, understand who God was, and be restored back to his kingdom. So that's awesome. But a point that I really want to dwell on a little bit before I actually finish out the chapter, because we're going to finish the chapter today, but I want to dwell on the end of verse 36. Let me read all of verse 36 again, but let me dwell on the very end of it, because it triggers something in my head, and I want to share it. It says, at the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom. And this part, and still more greatness was added to me. Still more greatness, meaning more than I had. I had a lot when I first lost my mind, and I got brought back to that. But even still more was added to me. That phrase, my mind is weird. It goes in different directions and connects weird things that probably nobody would connect. That phrase, when he says, still more greatness was added to me, that conjures up in my mind the prodigal son. And it's like, oh, this story is the prodigal son story all over again in a different way. But it's that story. And if you know the prodigal son story, and if you're a Christian, you know the prodigal son story. You know it. And if you know the prodigal son story, you're probably thinking like, that's crazy. How is the prodigal son story even related to the story? How does this bring this to your mind about the prodigal son related to Nebuchadnezzar and running out there like a cow eating grass and his hair growing like feathers and his nails growing like claws and having weird dreams about trees and being cut down with angels? How does that even come to you to make you think about the prodigal son story? And for those of you who don't know the prodigal son story, let me give it to you real quick so you can understand the connections I'm about to make. So the prodigal son story is found in the book of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. So book of Luke, chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. And it's a parable that Jesus gives. It's a story that Jesus tells to illustrate a point. I'm not going to talk about the point, but I'm going to talk about part of the story, not the whole thing, but part of it. And it's a story about a son who has a father, and the father's rich and wealthy, and the son is not happy. He's not satisfied with where he is in this relationship and with his father and everything. He's just not happy about his station in life. So he demands, not asks, not requests, but demands that his dad give him his part of the inheritance before his dad is dead. He says, give me the inheritance that I'm going to get, that I'm entitled to, and let me have it now. So his father gives him the inheritance, and he takes inheritance, and he skips the country. He goes to a faraway country, far away from his father, far away from his dad, and he just lives a crazy life. He lives with hookers, with drunkards. He just is just the party life. Has lots and lots of friends. But the money eventually runs out because he spends it so crazy, so wild. And just like when money runs out, your friends run out too. And all of a sudden, all those people that were his friends, they disappear. All those hookers, they disappear. All those wild women, they disappear because he has no more money. So why would they hang around with him? And so he runs out of money, and he gets to the point where he's starving. He's starving in this faraway country. And he begins to even say, like, man, my life is so bad right now. It's so bad. It was so much better with me when I was with my dad. It was so much better. It was so much better. I need to return back to my dad. And so he does. He goes back to his dad. Long story short, he goes back to his dad. He makes this speech about, I'm not worthy. Can you take me back as a servant? No, I'm not worthy to be your son. And the dad says, no, you're my son. And then the dad does this thing. The dad not only gives him back what he had under him. I mean, never mind the fact that he just spent his entire inheritance, so really wasn't entitled to anything. But the dad restored him back to the station that he was at, and then gave him more than that. And that's what this phrase triggers in my mind when he says, "And still more greatness was added to me." The prodigal son could say the same thing. I had a lot before I left. I did. But now that I'm back, I even got more than I had, and I don't deserve it. So that's why this connects to the prodigal son story for me too. But that's not the only point, because like I said, this is the prodigal son story. All of it is. From the time of the tree in his dream, and what the dream meant. Not so much the dream itself, because the prodigal son, we don't know we don't know if he had a dream. I'm not talking about that, but what the dream meant, and how it all came to pass, and how it all happened. This is the prodigal son story all over again. And you say, okay, all right, talk. How do you make the connections to the prodigal son story? And it's interesting because Nebuchadnezzar, he was able to return to the position that he had by recognizing who God was. If he had never recognized who God was, he could have been out there the rest of his life. But he recognized who God was. And the prodigal son, he was restored. He came back to his father because he recognized who his father was. He recognized who his father was in his life. And he came back to that. Nebuchadnezzar came back to his station, his position in life. And what's interesting too is the prodigal son. Well, let's say Nebuchadnezzar first. Nebuchadnezzar was out of his station. He lost his station because he went out of his mind. He went out of his mind. He lost his mind. He was out there eating grass like a cow, thinking he was a cow. So he lost his mind. He lost his station because he lost his mind. The prodigal son, if you read that story, not at the beginning, but kind of toward almost the end of the story, it says a very interesting statement about him. It says a very interesting statement. It says that after all his money was gone, and after he really crashed down to a very low point, it says in verse 17, it says, he came to his senses, or he came to himself, and said, I should go back to my father's house. He came to his senses. That means he was out of his senses. That means he was out of his mind. That meant that he lost his station, his position with his father, because he went crazy, because he was out of his senses. And if you are a person that you're not with God and you're not walking with God, and maybe you never walked with God, or maybe you did and now you're not, is because you lost your senses. You lost your mind. Yeah, you might say, well, I'm not eating wild stuff like a cow. But it's interesting though, the prodigal son, Nebuchadnezzar, was eating grass like a cow, so he was eating like an animal. He was eating animals' food. The prodigal son, right before he came to his senses, it says that he was looking at the food of animals, and pigs specifically. He was looking at the food of animals and wishing he could eat the food of animals. So Nebuchadnezzar was eating the food of animals. The prodigal son was wishing he could eat the food of animals. So they come down to a very animalistic level with regards to their appetites and things that they wanted and things that they looked for and things that they yearned for. And when you don't know God, you go down to a very animalistic level in your appetites and things that you want, things that you desire, because you start looking at really your what the scripture calls your carnal appetites. Carnal meaning your earthly desires, meaning physically. The one thing that pops up all the time is sex. It's like you start looking like, oh, I can have sex. I mean, is there any wonder why we're in a world now where sex reigns supreme? And I don't mean sex as far as, what traditionally people mean, like sex, jumping in from bed from one person to another. That's true too. But even the sexual revolution that's occurring. And I know this is dating this video a little bit, so if you're watching this 30 years later, you're like, wait a minute, sexual revolution, wasn't that earlier? Yeah. But right now, we're in it, and it's ongoing, where sexual identity is part of that, where sexual freedom is part of that. Those are carnal desires. Those are animalistic appetites. And maybe it's not sex. Maybe it's other things. Greed, like money. Got to have money. Got to have possessions. Got to have this. Got to have that. Got to have this. That's an animalistic appetite too. Because if you look at animals, they fight all the time for their food, for their territory, for whatever. They fight all the time. So greed, money, possessions, sex, all of this, all these animalistic appetites, you start eating like an animal, looking at things that you desire like an animal. And the only thing that raises your mind above that is a relationship with God. But you sink into these desires. And God is like, that's not a good place to be. But the only thing that's going to get you out of that is to recognize who God is. And that's really what it is. It's to recognize who God is. And the prodigal son, he lost his mind. But what caused him to lose his mind? Because it's the same thing that caused Nebuchadnezzar to lose his mind as well. What caused Nebuchadnezzar to lose his mind? You might say, well, he didn't recognize who God was. And that's true. That's true. But what's another way to say that? It's the same thing, but let's say another way to say that. Another way to say that is he was full of pride. Because that's what pride is. Pride is thinking, I'm God, and God's not. You might not say it that way, you might not think it that way, but the way you run your life is that way. It's like, I don't need God's help, I can do this. And that's that pride of Nebuchadnezzar. Look at what I've done for myself. Oh, isn't this great? That pride of the prodigal son. I don't need my dad anymore. I really don't need him. I can run my own life. I can do my own thing. I just need him to give me the money that I'm entitled to, and I'm gonna go do everything that I know I can do because I know how to live life. Both things are pride. Both things are pride. Because Daniel had warned Nebuchadnezzar. He had said, don't keep being prideful. Don't keep being sinful. Because if you do, this stuff is going to come upon you in this dream. Maybe if you stop, then you won't have to worry about this. He had tried to warn him. And for 12 months, apparently, Nebuchadnezzar must have listened. Because it says 12 months later is when all this stuff happened. So for 12 months, he must have listened. But then his pride, it just got the best of him. I'm so great. I'm so awesome. Look what I've done. The pride of the prodigal son. I don't need my father. I don't need my dad. I can do everything myself. And in both cases, they lost their mind because of their pride. And in both cases, their pride led to them losing their minds. It led to them becoming down to the level of animals in the way they lived and behaved, And the interesting thing is too about losing your mind. If you've lost your mind, you don't know that you've lost your mind. You don't know it. If you had asked Nebuchadnezzar while he was out there acting like a cow, eating grass, Nebuchadnezzar, have you lost your mind? He would have been, no. That's all the thing he would have said. He wouldn't have known what you were talking about. It was like he was being as natural as he knew he could be. He was a cow. Of course he was in his right mind. He was a cow. If you would have asked the prodigal son, while he was partying up with his friends and the hookers and the drunkards and all this other stuff, are you out of your mind? He would have been like, no, look at my life. Look at my life. My life is good. I got everything you could ever ask for. Look how my life is going. My life is amazing. How could anybody out of their mind have a life like this? I'm the life of the party. He wouldn't have recognized it. But the fact that the scripture says later he came to his senses means that he was out of his senses, but he couldn't recognize it. When you're out of your mind, you do not know that you're out of your mind. That's why I said that if Nebuchadnezzar's officials had come to him a day or two earlier to invite him back to the kingdom, he would have still been a cow. He would have still been a cow. So they couldn't have invited him back because he was out of his mind. And if they would have tried to reason with him and say, don't you know you're the king? You're the king. Come back to the kingdom. He would have not known what they were talking about, because as far as he was concerned, everything was the way it should be. He was a cow eating grass, living out in the dew, in the rain, with nails as long as claws and hair as long as feathers. Everything was right the way it was supposed to be. That would have been what he would have been thinking in his cow mind. And when you're crazy, when you're out of your mind, you don't know it. And when other people have to come and tell you you're out of your mind, but then you can't even hear it because you're out of your mind. So when people come to you and they say, you know, you need God in your life, what they're saying is, you're out of your mind. Come to God so he can put you in your mind. But you can't hear that. You can't hear it because you're out of your mind. Some people say, well, if God is such a God of love, why does he allow all this bad stuff to happen to me? Because you're out of your mind. And he's trying to do whatever he can to get you in your mind. He does everything. He does beautiful things for you. He gives you sunshine. He gives you beautiful moonlight. He gives you food on your table. He gives you friends to hang with. He does all this nice, just wonderful stuff for you. And you're like the prodigal son. You're like, no, I did it for myself. No, I did it for myself. And so that doesn't work. So then he has to try the mean stuff. Well, if I can't get you with the good stuff, I got to try the mean stuff. That's what worked with Nebuchadnezzar. That's what worked with the prodigal son. What got Nebuchadnezzar to recognize who God was and to be able to get into his right mind was being out, eating grass like a cow, running around crazy, with hair as long as feathers, nails as long as claws, out in the rain, thinking everything was normal. That's what got him back to his right mind, because that's what got him to recognize God is God. That's what got the prodigal son back to his right mind. Losing all of his money, losing all of his friends, just really crashing and burning in a hard way, to the fact where he was even starving and looking for food and looking at pigs' food. And it was that crashing and burning that brought him to his senses, that made him say, yeah, I need to go back to my dad. Sometimes God's able to get you with the nice stuff. But if that doesn't happen, he's like, well, I got to do the mean stuff, because somewhere or another, I got to get you into your right mind, because right now you're not in your right mind. I got to get you into sanity. The only way I can get you into sanity is for you to recognize who I am, because if you recognize who I am, that returns you to your senses. You can live the life you were designed to live and be the person you were designed to be, because without me, you can't. I know it's very popular now to say, be the person you were designed to be. Be your true self. You cannot be your true self without God. You cannot be the person you were designed to be without God. You can do all the things you think you should do to be your true self, but you're just living in those animalistic appetites, and really that's all it comes down to be. And you think, just like the prodigal son, things are the way they're supposed to be. You think, just like Nebuchadnezzar, things are the way they're supposed to be. But they're not. They're not. The only way you're going to live the way you were designed to live, be the person you were designed to be, is to be in your right mind. The only way to be in your right mind is to recognize who God is. and who he needs to be in your life. As long as you stay away from that, you're out in the woods, just like Nebuchadnezzar, running around, having all these things affect you, just like Nebuchadnezzar, and thinking, well, this is just a part of life. And it's not just a part of life. It was never meant to be the life. The rain that he was living in, the dew that was on him, covering him, the grass that was his bed, the trees that he was running around and probably urinating on, because that's what cows do. That was never the way life was supposed to be, but he thought it was. And God needs you. He wants you to know that the life you're living away from him was never the life you were meant to live, because there's so much more, but the only way to get it is through him. That's why this story connects with the prodigal son for me, because it's exactly the same story. It's exactly the same story. It's just different covering. The prodigal son was a guy who ran into a far country and spent a lot of money, but he was out of his mind, and finally came to his senses and came back to the Father, who was a picture of God. Nebuchadnezzar is a guy who was out of his mind, ran into a far country, out into the woods where he wasn't supposed to be, finally came to his mind and said, God is God, and got restored. And both got not only restored, but they got more than what they were supposed to have back. That's the beautiful thing about this story, and that's the awesome thing about this story, that it is the prodigal son story all over again. And I'll say one more thing on this point too before I finish up the next few verses, just to wrap things up. If you're a person who either was walking with the Lord, but you're not walking with him now, or you are a person who has never walked with the Lord, never even saw a reason to walk with the Lord, the Lord wants to do with the both of you, the person who walked with him but isn't walking now, the person who never walked with him, he wants to do exactly with you what he did with Nebuchadnezzar. He wants to restore you. For the person who's saying, well, I never walked with God, how can you restore me? Mankind, you're part of humanity. You're part of mankind. Humanity once walked with God. We lost our place and we've been insane ever since. People always say, why is the world so crazy? It's because the world is Nebuchadnezzar. The world is Nebuchadnezzar. And so he wants to restore mankind, but he also wants to restore the individuals within mankind to what we lost. And you are that individual. If you're a person that's never, well, like I said, you either never walked with God or you walked with God, but you're not anymore. But you want to be in your right mind. You're like, man, I really do want to come to him. But then you're looking at yourself and you're saying, but how could he accept me? I knew better. Especially if you're a person who walked with him before, you're like, I knew better. How can he accept me back? How can he take me back? How can he accept me the way that I am? Even if you're a person who never knew him, it's like, look at my life. How could he take me? How can he accept me? The awesome thing about this story about Nebuchadnezzar, and with the prodigal son too, but really Nebuchadnezzar really more exemplifies it, because the only thing that was required in all of this story for Nebuchadnezzar to get restored back to his station and to be elevated to get even more than he had was he simply had to recognize who God was. You don't see him making promises to God. You don't see him saying, I'll be better, I'll do this, You don't see him at all doing any of that. All you see him is looking up and saying, you're God. You're God. You rule everything. You control everything. I don't control anything. His pride was gone. All that pride of him walking on the rooftop and saying, look at everything I've done. It was gone. He was looking up and saying, not saying, look at everything I've done. He was like, look at everything that God does. If you will turn yourself to say, yeah, I know who he is, then you've taken the first step on the road to being restored. All you have to do now is say, Lord, forgive me. Forgive me for doing what I did, for thinking I could live the way that I did without consideration of you. You're God, I'm not. Bring me back into my right mind to know who you are and to live from that, to live knowing who you are. Live my life in such a way that reflects that I know who you are. Restore me, Lord. Restore me. Give me more than I had before, because I don't have much right now. Even if you think you have a lot, even if you're a billionaire and you're watching this, you don't have a lot because you don't have a right mind. There have been lots of rich people that have committed suicide because they recognize all the stuff I have, I don't have anything. Let God restore you. If you recognize who He is, you recognize who He is and you're not, that's all that's required. Now just ask for forgiveness and say, Lord, take me, please. I don't deserve it. Nebuchadnezzar could have said, I've been out here for 7 periods of time. I've been losing my mind, eating browse like who am I to come back to my kingdom? But God didn't care about any of that. He brought him back to His kingdom and restored him. Let Him bring you back. Let Him restore you. Let Him bring you into your right mind. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all His works are right and His ways are just. Let me say something real quick about what he just said. When he says, for all His works are right and His ways are just. You have to recognize that too. Because if you don't recognize that all of His ways are right, all of His ways are just, then you really haven't recognized who He is. And you really are still not in your right mind. Because if you think that when God decrees that homosexuality is not of Him, if you believe that you can choose your own gender, if you believe that a lot of other things I can say that can go around long too, then you're saying that God's ways aren't right and they're not just, and you figured out a better way to do it. You're still out of your mind. And I'm just using those as examples. There's a whole bunch of other things. I could say, if you feel like, well, I don't see what's wrong with sex outside of marriage. I don't see why I can't sleep with my boyfriend. I don't see why I can't sleep with my girlfriend. I don't see why I can't get drunk every time that I want to. Drinking is not a sin, but getting drunk is. And God's very clear about that. If I want to celebrate Jesus' birthday on Christmas by getting drunk, then he should be honored by that. No. So again, there's lots and lots of things where, well, if I feel like I want to cheat on my taxes, or I want to lie to the government to get more money, and all this other stuff that you can feel like, God, you don't understand. Your ways are not right and they're not just. You're asking me not to do these things. I don't see anything wrong with them. You have to be like Nebuchadnezzar, where he says, all His works are right and His ways are just. All of them. You have to come to Him and say, Lord, I don't understand. I don't understand why you say this is just and this is right and this is not just and this is not right. I really, really don't understand. But I do recognize that you are God. And even though I don't understand, I need to submit myself to you. So Lord, help me to either understand or help me not to care so that I can serve you. Because a lot of times what we try to understand in our human mind gets in the way of serving God, when our human mind really just doesn't understand. We're not God. We don't understand His ways. We don't understand. We can't see things the way He sees things. And so we think we're seeing things right when we're completely seeing things wrong. And so in those cases, we need to say, Lord, either help me understand and I'll be okay, or if you don't help me to understand, help me not to care about this and just do what you want me to do. And then He's able to help you. Okay? So and then the last little bit of that, and because I'll read again verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all His works are right and His ways are just. And those who walk in pride He is able to humble. So that ends the chapter. If this video in any way was beneficial to you, in any way you found intriguing, you found helpful, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up, give it a like, also give a comment. And I would really, really love it if you haven't subscribed. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you feel like this is beneficial to you. And I would really, really, really love it if you shared the video. If you found it was beneficial to you and you think other people would benefit from it, then go ahead and share them. Not because I'm trying to make money off of this. I'm not trying to be well known and become famous, but I really, really want people to grow in their walk with the Lord. And if you feel that this video will help them to do that, then please share it with them, because that really is my heart, that people grow in their relationship with God and their love toward Him, and that they walk in His love toward them. Okay? All right, take care. Okay, bye-bye.